So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining session 3 on emerging risks and challenges. My name is Kana from Graduate School of Economics, and I'm chairing this session. So the main objective of this session is to understand and discuss emerging risks and their associated challenges, as well as possible responses in the time of compound global risk. This session comprises 2 presentations. The first presentation will be given by Professor Anna PETRIG from University of Basel. She will present on technology and risks from the perspective of the law of sea and human rights law. And then Professor Arinori KAWAMURA from Graduate School of Global Humanities and Social Science, specialized in criminal law, international human health law, and maritime law enforcement, will serve as her discussants. The second presentation will be given by Dr. Kazutaka OKA from National Institute for Environmental Studies. As the head of Climate Change Impact Monitoring Research Session at the Center for Climate Change Adaptation, he will present on climate change impact on health and adaptation measures. After that, the Professor Lina MADANIYAZI from School of Tropical Medicine, Tropical Disease and Global Health, who is the environmental biologist, will serve as his discussants. So after 2 presentations, we will invite Professor Yumiko TAMURA from the Faculty of Economics as a commentator, drawing on her many years of working experience at the International Aid Organization. She will provide comments on emerging risks and challenges from both academic and practitioner perspectives. So now I'd like to invite Professor PETRIG. The floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon. It's really a great pleasure and an equally great honor to present at this symposium on risks and international community. And I would like to very warmly thank the organizers and especially Professor Kawamura for the continued and successful cooperation between Nagasaki University and the University of Basel. New technologies generally entail risks, and regulation is an essential tool to prevent risks from materializing or at least to contain them. However, the regulation of emerging technologies raises distinct challenges. In my presentation, I would like to discuss these challenges using an example of an emerging technology where Japan has a leading role, namely autonomous ships. So new technologies almost always trigger debate, not only about their potential benefits, but also about the risks they may entail. This is particularly true for emerging technologies, even more so if they're disruptive, meaning that they completely change the way how we do things. Views often differ widely on whether a new technology involves risks at all, and if so, what risks that may be. Assessing risks that an emerging technology involves is challenging, and generally we only know with hindsight whether the risk assessment was correct. Let me illustrate this with a technology that today is widespread, normalized, and firmly embedded in our daily lives, generally perceived as highly beneficial and very low risks. And it's also a technology of which both Japan and Switzerland are proud of. Japan for its high-tech version, and Switzerland more from a cultural heritage perspective, and I'm obviously speaking of trains. Trains are a good example of how widely views can differ when it comes to the assessment of risks associated with a new technology. The steam engine was a core technology of the first industrial revolution and was quickly and successfully put to use for a wide range of purposes. Its most spectacular application, however, was the steam locomotive. With it began the railway era, an era that fundamentally transformed mobility and transport. Exactly 200 years ago, in 1825, locomotion number 1, which you see on the picture, a steam locomotive built in Great Britain, made history. In September of that year, it became the first locomotive to carry passengers on a public railway on the Stockton-Darlington line. And on a side note, yesterday I visited Glover Garden and I read that Mr. Glover actually brought the first steam locomotive to Nagasaki. So the first people in Japan who saw this emerging technology was the Nagasaki people. So railways really became the symbol of technological progress in the 19th century. But how were they assessed at the time in terms of risks and benefits? Opinions covered the entire spectrum. Proponents of this new technology regarded the railway as a clear indicator of civilizational progress. They emphasized that large quantities of goods and people could now be transported over land much faster and at significantly lower cost than ever before. Punctuality in transport operations was seen as another fundamental innovation. And more broadly, they highlighted the new opportunities the railway created for communication, trade, and industry. Some proponents even went further and invested in this disruptive technology with almost boundless expectation. Let me give you one illustrative example from Basel, the city where I work at the university. Writing in 1841, Professor Eckstein, then editor of that newspaper, Neue Basler Zeitung, predicted, I quote, "Industrialization driven by the railway would finally transform the long-standing utopian dream of a peaceful world into reality." However, there were also highly critical voices who saw no good in the railway at all and stressed the risks that this new technology may entail. They portrayed the trains as the work of the devil, as fire-breathing dragons that endangered and poisoned everything in their vicinity. These critical voices warned of serious health risks that travel by train involves. These concerns were taken seriously. When the first German railway was constructed between Nuremberg and Fürth, an expert report on potential health risks was commissioned from the Bavarian Medical Council. In 1835, the council published its report and concluded, I quote, and it's a translation, "Travel by any kind of steam engine should be prohibited for health reasons. The rapid motion will cause mental unrest in passengers known as delirium furiosum. The mere sight of a locomotive moving at full speed is sufficient to trigger the serious illness. It is therefore absolutely necessary that barriers at least 6 feet high be erected on both sides of the track." In other words, not only traveling by train, but even seeing a train passing by, and we speak of a maximum speed of 30 kilometers per hour, was considered a serious health risk. Recently, I watched a video on Instagram of people observing the world's fastest bullet train, the Japanese maglev, as it passed by a world record speed of 500 kilometers per hour, 15 times more than a 19th century railway. And the people did not quite suffer from mental unrest, but were positively excited. So the railway example illustrates how difficult risk assessment can be when technologies are still emerging, particularly when they are disruptive. With the benefit of hindsight, we know that the assessment of risks of railways, a core technology of the first industrial revolution, was deeply wrong. Today, we even read reports such as the one of the Bavarian Medical Council with a certain sense of amusement. Of course, science has advanced significantly since the 19th century, but at the same time, technologies have also become far more complex. Think of technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, such as artificial intelligence, robotics, or information technology. These are technologies involved in autonomous ships. And there are notable parallels between the core technologies of the first industrial revolution and those commonly associated with the fourth industrial revolution, which we are currently experiencing. First of all, once again, mobility and transport constitute an important era of application of these emerging technologies. Think, for example, of driverless cars and what I will speak about in a moment, autonomous ships. Second, once again, views on the risks involved in the use of these technologies differ widely. And third, many risks are uncertain or not yet fully understood. And it may only be in hindsight that we actually know whether our current risk assessment was wrong or correct. The difficulty of assessing risks in new technologies is closely linked to how these technologies are regulated. Where risks are considered unacceptable, regulation may seek to prohibit their use or even their development. So more often, however, regulation aims to contain or minimize the risks while allowing innovation to proceed. Either way, the regulation of emerging technologies poses exceptional challenges. It is these challenges that I would like to explore in the remainder of my presentation using the example of autonomous ships. So if left unregulated, autonomous ships may pose considerable risks. At the same time, regulating them is far from straightforward. I would like to highlight 4 challenges regarding regulation. The first challenge concerns the high number of rules potentially in need of reinterpretation or amendment. We will see that autonomous ships no longer fulfill a basic assumption on which rules regulating ships rest, namely that ships have a crew on board. If the premise of a rule is wrong, then maybe the rule as such may also be wrong. As a result, almost every rule on shipping may be in need of an update in order to sensibly regulate autonomous ships. The second challenge arises from the thematic breadth and diversity of regulation required. We will see in a couple of minutes that autonomous ships can take many different forms and be used for very different purposes. Depending on the technology involved and its distinct use, the risks differ, and also the regulation that could contain these risks. So many bodies of law, and not just 1 or 2, are in need of revision. The third challenge, flowing from the second, relates to the fact that for different subject matters, regulation at different levels, domestic, regional, international, may be required, and at each level, you have different regulators. Then the fourth challenge stems from the fact that autonomous ships are an emerging technology. Even where a regulator is competent and has a clear understanding of what technology and what use and risk it seeks to regulate, it is formidably difficult to determine what, when, and how to regulate an emerging technology. Let me explore in a bit more detail the first challenge. I have mentioned that the advent of autonomous ships amounts to a foundational change for the rules governing ships because it challenges a basic assumption on which this rule rests, namely that ships have an onboard crew responsible for their operation, mission, and task. If there is one truism that runs through the thousands of years of maritime history, it is actually that ships have people on board. Shipping has undergone tremendous transformations from sail to steam, from steam to containerization. However, all these revolutionary developments remained aligned with the same underlying premise, notably that ships are crewed with an onboard crew. With autonomous ships, this assumption, however, no longer holds true. And when the assumption on which a rule is built no longer applies, then the rule itself may no longer be fit for purpose. To use an analogy, it would be like regulating railways based on the assumption that they cause serious health risk, even merely watching them. So if the underlying assumption is wrong, the regulation built upon it may also no longer be correct. Because the assumption of an onboard crew underlines almost every rule governing shipping, maritime law, the law of the sea, criminal law, and so on, the advent of autonomous ships entails a foundational shift for all of them. As a result, almost the entire existing regulatory framework dealing in one way or the other with ships is in need of amendment. So we speak of many, many different rules. Let me briefly recall the second challenge, which concerned the thematic breadth of regulation. Autonomous ships may be used for very different purposes and in very different contexts. As a result, the risks involved vary considerably, and so do the legal regimes that may be affected, ranging from domestic criminal law to maritime law to the law of the sea. Even law of naval warfare may be affected. What would have sounded like a futuristic scenario barely a decade ago is increasingly becoming a reality: autonomous ships cruising the oceans. And in practice, this really involves a variety of technologies and an equally wide range of uses. To begin with, there is commercial shipping. Japan is at the forefront of developing remotely controlled vessels that are intended ultimately to operate without an onboard crew. A headline from 2020, which you see here, states that Japan set itself the ambitious goal of making half of its cargo fleet autonomous by 2040. Just a few days ago, I read in a press release from the Nippon Foundation that a regular passenger ferry using autonomous navigation technology is expected to begin commercial operation as of next spring. Regulation in this context must ensure, for example, that such vessels do not collide with other ships, that they can communicate with authorities, and that despite the absence of a crew, they can, for instance, display certificates upon request. If these issues are not addressed, risks such as collision or other accidents are likely to materialize. At the same time, as reports about beneficial uses of autonomous ships have multiplied, so have the headlines about their malicious criminal use. Among the most widely reported incidents are the attacks by Houthi rebels using remotely controlled explosive-laden boats against merchant vessels and other targets in the Red Sea. This summer, Colombia's Navy has seized uncrewed narco subs transporting large quantities of narcotics. These examples provide striking evidence that criminal actors have already begun to embrace this new technology in ways that seriously threaten maritime security. From the perspective of offenders, this new type of vessel offers a significant advantage. It opens up new and, for criminals, less risky ways of committing crime at sea. At the same time, however, autonomous crafts are increasingly used by law enforcement authorities themselves, such as coast guards and navies, which enhances their capability, effectiveness, and reach. Australia, for instance, uses autonomous craft to detect illegal fishing, or Singapore unveiled recently that it will use autonomous ships to patrol its coastal areas. The use of autonomous craft by both offenders and law enforcement authorities has far-reaching implications for maritime security law as a whole. This body of law rests on the assumption that ships are crewed, concretely that perpetrators of maritime crime are on board the suspect vessel, and that law enforcement officials are physically present on authorized law enforcement vessels. Once autonomous ships are used both by suspects and offenders, it can no longer be taken for granted that suspects and enforcers will encounter each other in theater in a human-to-human interaction. This has very concrete and practical consequences. Today, for example, a warning shot may be fired to compel a suspect ship to stop. But what effect does a warning shot have if there is no crew on board and no one to impress by a warning shot? How do law enforcement authorities identify themselves vis-à-vis a master of a suspect ship if there is no master on board? Do uniforms, markings, ID cards still fulfill their function if there is no one present to see them and to verify them? More fundamentally, why stop a vessel when there is no one to arrest? And what does it mean for the use of force? Can we use more robust force without further ado because there is no life to endanger? But how do we know whether it's an unmanned vessel or a manned vessel which simply doesn't answer a request? At this stage, these questions far outnumber the answers. Let me now turn to the third challenge, which is closely linked to the previous one. Depending on the technology involved, the use in question, and the risks to be addressed, different types of regulation may be required. As a result, regulation may be needed at different levels, domestic, regional, or even international. At present, most autonomous ships that are in trial phase or which are actually used are navigating in domestic waters. In these cases, it is primarily the domestic legislator that is called upon to regulate them, maybe with some coordination at the regional level. However, as the technology advances, autonomous ships are likely to operate increasingly in international waters. To ensure their safe, secure, and efficient use in such settings, regulation at the international level becomes indispensable. This is precisely why the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, that's the UN specialized agency for shipping, has stepped in and launched an important regulatory project on autonomous ships, to which I will return in short. At the same time, the regulatory mandate of the IMO, of the International Maritime Organization, is limited. The IMO can update the treaties adopted under its auspices, but it has no competence to change treaties adopted by other actors. For instance, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is also termed the Constitution for the Oceans, it has no power to review or to amend. So the problem is that beyond the IMO's efforts, which are highly significant and important, there is currently no comprehensive international regulatory project addressing autonomous ships. So for this reason, I will focus in the following primarily on the regulatory work undertaken within the International Maritime Organization and on the category of autonomous vessels which they draft regulation for, which are merchant vessels. However, please bear in mind that in the future, many more regulators should step in if we want to comprehensively regulate autonomous ships. With this, let me turn to the fourth challenge. The world of shipping has changed profoundly since the IMO started its work in 1958, and new technological innovations such as radar, automatic identification systems, or refrigeration on board has always been the driver for new rules adopted by the IMO. In this sense, the fact that new technologies trigger new regulation or amendments to existing regulation is not as such new. Containerization, for example, had a really transformative impact on shipping and needed also a regulatory response. Containers, standardized cargo units, enabled seamless multimodal transport, dramatically reduced the loading time and cargo loss, and reshaped port infrastructure and labor practices. It facilitated the rise of ever larger vessels and economies of scale, and it significantly expanded global trade by lowering costs. However, autonomous ships differ considerably from past technological innovations, even those deemed revolutionary at the time, such as containerization, because it's an emerging technology. As we will see now, the question of what to regulate, when to regulate, and how to regulate are much more challenging if we have an emerging technology rather than a stable, fully developed one, such as a container. As just mentioned, it's challenging for the regulator to understand and identify the regulatory object. The what to regulate question is challenging. Why is this so? So, first, a defining feature of autonomous ships is that they do not rely on a single, relatively simple technology, but on several technology at once. Artificial intelligence, robotics, information technology are just three core technologies of the fourth industrial revolution that are commonly associated with autonomous ships, but each of these technology encompasses a variety of other technologies. These technologies are far more complex than earlier innovations. While everyone has a clear idea of what a shipping container is, essentially a standardized metal box, it's much more difficult for a regulator to grasp concepts such as autonomy. Moreover, the technologies involved in autonomous ships, i.e. robotics, information technologies, are disruptive technologies. They really change how things are done in our daily lives. As a result, they are difficult to fully understand, including the risks they may entail. Understanding autonomous ships is further complicated by the fact that many of the relevant applications are still in development. Autonomous ships thus involve technologies that can be described as inchoate, that is far from fully developed. In this respect, they differ fundamentally from containers, which have remained largely unchanged since the 1950s, and the very concept rests on standardization. A further difference from past innovations is the speed of technological change. Emerging technologies today are developing at an unprecedented pace. In the maritime context, the IMO Secretary General observed that the next 10 to 20 years may bring as much change technology-wise as the past 100 years. These ever shorter innovation cycles intensify the so-called pacing problem, the fact that law tends to lag behind technological development. It is therefore very likely that autonomous ships technology will mature much faster than the regulator can adapt regulation. Overall, at this stage, it's simply too early to reliably predict the ultimate outcome of this technological transition, in particular the levels of autonomy and forms of autonomous ships that will become the industry standards. A next challenge, which is just as difficult as identifying the regulatory object, is determining when to regulate, the so-called when question. Regulating too early carries obvious risks. The rules may be poorly aligned with the technology as it eventually develops and may lock in inferior technological choices. The rules may even be outdated by the time they enter into force because they are based on anticipated rather than the actual technological outcome. Timing is further complicated by the fact that regulation requires a sense of imminence. Political and regulatory support is usually only forthcoming once a technology is perceived as close to practical use, when it moves from the abstract to the concrete. Within the IMO, however, the sense of imminence differs markedly between member states. It is no coincidence that states that are at the forefront of developing autonomous ships, such as Japan or the Republic of Korea, were among the first to call for timely regulation. Finally, one must bear in mind that integrating autonomous ships within the IMO's legal framework will take years. This too has to be factored into the question of timing. In short, the IMO is faced with a paradox. It is advised at the same time to wait and to hurry. Another major challenge in regulating autonomous ships is choosing the right regulatory tools. So what we have seen so far suggests that emerging technologies require a regulatory process that allows for constant review and adjustment so that new facts, new technology, new experience can be taken into account. In other words, regulatory processes and techniques must be fast, adaptable, and flexible. At international level, the traditional regulatory tool are treaties. However, treaty making is a very, very slow process. Negotiating a treaty often takes years. After adoption, it still has to be ratified by a sufficient number of states before it can enter into force. A process that can take many more years. In many countries, ratification is not a purely governmental decision, but requires parliamentary approval. In Switzerland, there could even be a popular vote. And it is not only the adoption of a treaty that is time-consuming, but also its amendment can be equally slow. Taken together, this shows that the classical international lawmaking through treaties is a notoriously slow and rigid process. It is therefore ill-suited on its own to regulate a fast-developing technology that is likely to remain in permanent transition. However, next to treaties, there is another form of regulation that has gained considerable prominence in the past decade. It's informal law, or also called soft law. This includes instruments such as guidelines or standards, codes of conduct, or manuals. Informal law differs from treaties in several important ways. First of all, informal law is not legally binding, and yet it has considerable normative force, particularly when developed by an actor with a high degree of authority in a given field and through processes that involve key stakeholders. The IMO, for example, regularly adopts non-binding, like legally non-binding instruments in the field of shipping that nonetheless are having considerable normative force and are obeyed by. Because informal law is not legally binding, the sovereignty costs for states are lower. This often makes agreement easier, and in addition, informal instruments do not require ratification. That means they can be adopted and amended much more quickly compared to a treaty. Another important difference concerns participation. Treaty making is reserved to states. Informal law, by contrast, is often developed through so-called multi-stakeholder processes, in which non-state actors, such as the industry or technical experts, play an important role. This allows specialized knowledge and practical experience to be integrated in the regulatory process more easily, which is extremely important if we are regulating a complex, emerging technology. Overall, informal lawmaking is characterized by speed, adaptability, and flexibility that are precisely the qualities that are needed to respond, at least in part, to the regulatory challenges posed by emerging technologies. That said, treaties also have certain advantages. For instance, they are legally binding, so if they are violated, you can go to court and enforce the law. And the ratification process provides a degree of democratic legitimacy at the domestic level, something informal law lacks. Formal law and informal law are therefore very different regulatory techniques, each with distinct strengths and weaknesses. And this begs the question whether they could not be combined in a way that leads to an effective regulatory approach. In practice, they are increasingly combined, and informal law fulfills different functions in relation to a treaty, which can be summarized as a post-law, a pre-law, and a para-law function, depending on whether informal law complements, paves the way, or replaces a treaty. And let me briefly illustrate these three functions informal law can take vis-à-vis a treaty at the example of how the IMO is regulating autonomous ships. So first of all, informal law can be used to interpret existing treaty provision. In the context of autonomous ships, the IMO has carried out a scoping exercise in recent years, examining how current shipping treaties apply to autonomous vessels. And one of the key results was that actually a lot of treaty provisions need a reinterpretation. For example, it's unclear what the term master means, which is a term which appears in many provisions related to shipping. So what is the functional equivalent of a master if you have a remotely controlled ship which is remotely controlled from on shore? Who exercises the role and bears the responsibilities of the master when the bridge is taken ashore? So one way to address this would be for the IMO to adopt an informal instrument providing guidance on how the term master should be understood in the context of autonomous ships. And this is important because if every flag state adopts its own interpretation, this would kind of undermine the mandate of the IMO and also prevent seamless shipping across the world. So this is the post-law function of informal law. Informal law may also pave the way for the adoption of new treaty rules. Informal law making can serve as a tool to get the normative ball rolling. It offers an effective starting point where states need reassurance before engaging in novel and previously unregulated activities, such as the operation of autonomous ships. Moreover, informal law is often praised as a means to consolidating political support and finding common ground on the need for action in a given field. It is frequently understood as a temporary solution, one that bridges the gap until further and firmer regulatory commitment is possible, such as the adoption of a treaty. Informal law also allows to gain experience in a certain regulatory field. This experience can then later be used to refine the regulatory framework, and therefore informal law often serves as a testing ground for regulatory concepts which, if they prove successful, may later be incorporated in treaties. And to ensure this feedback loop function, relevant actors often expressly invite the stakeholders to report back on the experience made with the respective regulation. So informal law has a pre-law function. At present, the IMO is in the process of developing a non-binding code for autonomous ships, an informal instrument which is expected to be adopted in 2026. From December 26 onwards, a framework for an experience-building phase will be elaborated. And from 28 on, work will begin on a treaty on a mandatory code on autonomous ships, drawing both on the experience gained from the non-mandatory code, informal law, and the experience-building phase. So at times, regulators choose to rely on informal law rather than formal law, that is a treaty. In such cases, informal law fulfills a para-law function. As we have seen, the IMO ultimately aims to adopt a treaty on autonomous ships. Informal law will nevertheless continue to play an important role. This is because the IMO tends to pursue a so-called goal-based approach. As the name suggests, in the treaty itself, only the goals to be achieved and the criteria to be satisfied in order to achieve it are regulated rather than any technical detailed rules. The detailed regulation necessary to implement the goal-based approach is instead developed outside the treaty in informal law instruments. This informal law may be adopted by the IMO or even by actors outside the IMO, such as classification societies or industry actors, including shipbuilders. The reason for this approach is straightforward. A treaty contains only broad principles and is more likely to withstand the passage of time. By contrast, detailed technical rules need to be updated regularly and quickly, something that is difficult to achieve through treaty making, but easier to achieve through informal law. So overall, the IMO combines classic treaty making with informal law in many various ways to respond, at least in part, to the challenges posed by autonomous ships. So let me conclude. I guess I have demonstrated that already the risk assessment is difficult when it comes to emerging technologies, and the regulator has always to work with the best possible risk assessment, even if it may turn out wrong at the end. And even then, it's challenging to regulate autonomous ships for the reasons I have mentioned. We may not be able to rely on conventional approaches. Rather, I would say we need unconventional approaches to regulate unconventional ships, to which autonomous ships certainly belong. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Professor PETRIG. So now I'd like to invite our discussant, Professor KAWAMURA, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Arinori Kawamura. I am an associate professor of graduate school and School of Global Humanities and Social Sciences. I specialize in criminal law and particularly criminal procedural law. These pictures are taken during my visit with Professor Kitagawa, Waseda Law School, and Professor Shintani, Japan Coast Guard Academy this September. We took a boat down the Rhine River. It was not an autonomous boat. Autonomous vehicles, maybe you know that, are categorized into 5 levels. In Japan, the current stage is level 4, fully automated driving under specific conditions, such as in sparsely populated areas or on highways, where the system performs all driving tasks. The amended Japanese road traffic law, effective April 1st, 2003, introduced regulatory requirements for level 4 autonomous vehicles. These include a permission from a prefectural public safety commission, the appointment of designated autonomous operation supervisor to manage the automated operation, the designation of a major implementer to take necessary actions when no man on the vehicle, and provisions for legal liability in the accident during automated operation. Discussions are going on regarding how to regulate level 5 autonomous vehicles. According to Choson Ilbo, Korean newspaper, a week ago, December 12th, a serious accident occurred in China by unmanned autonomous taxi, resulting in 2 serious injuries. It does not seem to be a fake news, but for some reasons, the article became unvaluable the following day. I'm not sure how China managed to legislate it on their national law, state law. Today's PETRIG Sensei's presentation addressed the challenges of regulating risk through legislation as technology evolves. From a legal perspective concerning technology risk and and legal regulation. Legal regulation encompasses regulation through hard law, such as criminal law, and regulation through soft law. Criminal law regulations aim to prevent acts that infringe on the legal interests of individual or society by imposing penalties for such acts, classifying them as crimes. These regulations are applied through laws, examining the meaning and the necessity of regulation to address current problems. Furthermore, PETRIG sensei argued that we must consider informal regulatory law while anticipating the risk associated with immature, not fully developed technologies. Specifically, the legal regulations for autonomous ships were addressed. Autonomous ships refer to all vessels, whether manned or unmanned. They are remotely operated or operated autonomously. As PETRIG sensei also mentioned, the International Maritime Organization, IMO, commenced work in 2017 involving Maritime Safety Committee, Legal Committee, and Facilitation Committee to organize the issues concerning how the operation of maritime autonomous surface ships must impact IMO instruments. And autonomous ships significantly impact not only existing rules, that is, the legal regulations governed by IMO instruments, but also the legal framework of the United Nations Convention on the Law of Sea, we say UNCLOS. In particular, Article 94, Section 1 of the United Nations Convention of the Law of Sea stipulates that states shall exercise effective jurisdiction over their flag vessels in respect of administrative, technical, and social matters in all maritime zones. This raised the question of who will exercise jurisdiction and implement regulations concerning autonomous ships. PETRIG sensei argues that while regulating autonomous ships based on predicted risk is difficult, it is important to consider regulation through informal regulatory law. She states that we must consider the nature of legal regulation, what should be regulated, and how. For instance, she highlighted the need to consider legal regulation concerning the transport of drugs by unmanned autonomous ship for the purpose of smuggling and selling drugs in another country. These are pictures taken during my visit the IMO last September. Regarding technology and risk and legal regulations, I recently presented the research at the Japan's Gender Law Association annual meeting held in Tokyo, highlighting the importance of regulating AI adult content and deepfake pornography, and proposing significant regulatory approaches. I introduced Taiwan and Korean criminal law provisions concerning the creation, processing, distribution, possessions, purchase, and the viewing of such AI adult content and deepfake pornography, and argued for the necessity of registration in Japan. While regulating technological risk can be challenging due to the difficulty in foreseeing risk, it is essential to focus on a proactive legal regulation rather than reactive regulation. In Japan, autonomous ships are level 4, which is the second phase. Organizations are restricted to Japan's territorial waters. The goal is to realize unmanned autonomous ships by 2025. We need to continue to consider law, regulations, and technological risks. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kawamura. Actually, I forgot to tell you, but QA session will come at the end. So please keep your question and comment for first presentation until the end. So now I'd like to invite second presenter, Dr. Oka, please.
So hello everyone. So my name is Kazutaka OKA. I'm from National Institute for Environmental Studies. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for this wonderful opportunity. Okay, so my presentation title is Climate Change Impact on Health and Adaptation Measures. Okay, so before talking about history, let me show the temperature changes in Japan. So this figure shows the changes in summer temperature in Japan. And this is year, and this is a kind of difference from a certain period. So you can see the temperature, summer temperature in Japan is increasing at the rate of 1.38 degrees Celsius by 100 years due to climate change. And looking at the top 5 ranking of hot years, all of them are after 2010 and all of them are 2020. So this is very natural because temperature is gradually increasing. And the hottest year on record is 2025. So 2.36 degrees Celsius. So it's very, very hot this year. So then what is the association between temperature and historical cases? So this figure shows the association between daily maximum temperature and historical incidence. So here, the historical incidence means historical cases per population. On the other hand, so this figure shows the association between daily maximum WGT and also historical incidence. So we can see both figures clearly show the association between this, heat index and also historical incidence. Okay, so as I mentioned, temperature is becoming very hot in Japan, and heat stroke is becoming very, very serious in Japan. So this figure shows the number of patients with heat stroke transported by ambulance. And so looking at this figure, so especially in recent years, the number of heat stroke cases is more than 95,000 cases per year. And looking at this, extremely hot years, so the record was broken. So this number beyond, firstly beyond the, 1,000. 10万人超えた. Sorry, this number is wrong. Sorry. Anyway, so we see so many, heat stroke cases in Japan, and temperature is increasing. So we expect that heat stroke will become more serious in the future due to the, climate change. Okay, so this is the same, statistics, but looking at by age group and also the location of occurrence of heat stroke cases. And looking at the, by age group, so this, orange color show the elderly. So from these statistics, we can see that almost half of the all cases are for the elderly. So, we are facing an aging society in Japan. Heat stroke will be more serious in the future, so due to aging in society. And also, when we look at the location of occurrence, so this blue part shows the residence. Maybe you expect that heat stroke will, occur outside, but in fact, looking at these statistics, 40% of heat stroke cases occurred at residence. Anyway, so from this statistic, we can find that what kind of measure is important to reduce the risk of heat stroke cases. Okay, so this figure shows the number of deaths by heat stroke. And so in recent years, so the number of deaths due to heat stroke is around 1,500 cases in each year. And again, so we don't have these latest statistics of 2025. So latest one is 2024. So 2024 is also very hot year. So in 2024, the number of deaths due to heat stroke is 2,160. And so the number of deaths by natural disaster, annual number of deaths by natural disaster is approximately 100 to 200. So compared to these numbers, we can see that the impact of heat stroke is very, very serious in Japan. And another important point of this statistic is that deaths due to heat stroke, elderly account for approximately 80% of all heat stroke death cases. So from these statistics, we can see that countermeasure for elderly is especially important, particularly important to reduce the risk of heat stroke in Japan. So, heat stroke is already very, very serious issues in Japan. And to reduce the risk of heat stroke, so many adaptation measures have been implemented by the government. Among them, one of the main initiatives is called Heat Stroke Alert. So then what is Heat Stroke Alert? So Heat Stroke Alert is an initiative when the heat index, so we call it WGT, it's expected to be 33 degrees or higher on a given day or the next day. And these are the number of alerts issued in each year. So again, in the extremely hot year of 2025, the number of alerts issued is 1,749 times across Japan. So anyway, so we have so many alerts issued in each year. Okay, so similar to heat stroke alert, but a new initiative also started in 2024. So this initiative is called Special Heat Stroke Alert. So what is Special Heat Stroke Alert? So in this initiative, alert is issued when WGT for the next day at all evaluation point in a prefecture reaches 35 degrees Celsius or higher. However, at this moment, even in 2024, it's a hot year of 2024 or 2025, no special heat stroke alert was issued because this threshold is very, very high, looking at the current situation of heat condition in Japan. And also, this is very kind of important information. So, what colors are used to display heat stroke alert and a special alert? So we have a kind of committee gathering, and we fixed which color we utilize. So regarding heat stroke special alert, we decided to use black color, and also if it comes to heat stroke alert, so we decided to use purple. These are formal color for this alert. Okay, so another new initiative started in 2024. In this initiative, when special heat stroke alert is issued, the mayor of a city, town, or village is required to open facilities where citizens can escape heat. And so, cooling shelter map is also available to support citizens and find nearby shelters when it's hot outside. Okay, so maybe most of the people here already know heat stroke alert in your daily life. So, but we still have a couple of issues to be addressed in terms of function of heat stroke alert. So I just list up some couple of issues should be addressed. So firstly, let me talk about heat stroke incidence rate at the threshold. I mean, WGT 33 varies by prefecture and age groups. So this figure shows the heat stroke incidence for each 47 prefecture and each age groups. And the red color shows, the heat stroke incidence rate is high, and the blue color shows the, heat stroke rate is not so high compared to red one. So you can see the, differences among prefectures and among age groups, especially looking at the elderly groups. Even at the same WGT value, heat stroke incidence rate is higher compared to other age groups. And also, when we compare north part of Japan and the south part of Japan, so even at the same WGT, heat stroke incidence rate is higher in north part of Japan. This is because they are not so resilient to hot temperature, or penetration rate of air conditioning is not so high compared to those in south part of Japan. Anyway, so even at the same WGT value, there is differences in terms of heat stroke risk. So now, we have a very important discussion whether we should change the threshold in accordance with these differences in terms of age groups, age differences, or regional differences. However, the difficult point is that if the more detailed threshold for each age groups or for each regions, so more difficult to communicate. For instance, so your threshold is 33, your threshold is 35. So it is very difficult to communicate. So this is so maybe in a good way we have to solve these issues. And so this is another issue should be addressed to improve the heat stroke alert. So far I just focus on the single impact of hot temperature. However, in recent years, there is a concern about the occurrence of a compound impact. One of the examples of this compound impact is the combination of natural disaster and hot temperature or heat wave. So this is the example of this compound impact. So in September 2019, the strongest typhoon on record made landfall in the Kanto region. And so this typhoon directly caused 9 deaths and also 160 injury in Kanto region. At the same time, power outage occurred due to this, typhoon heat. And 498 people are transported by ambulance due to heat stroke. And this number is approximately twice compared to that number of the previous weeks. So in that week, air conditioning is functioning. So due to power outage, so more people are transported by ambulance due to heat stroke. So in this sense, so how we prepare measures against this kind of compound impact is very, very important looking at these cases. So the question is that then how should the alert threshold be set during power outage in the high temperature conditions? So these are issues should be addressed to improve the function of heat stroke alert. At this moment, we do not have any clear idea to solve these issues, but these are things we have to think. Okay, so far I just look at the current situation of heat stroke. From now on, I would like to focus on the future heat stroke in Japan. Before talking about future heat stroke, I would like to introduce the temperature change. How much the temperature increase in the future. So the temperature increase in the future depend on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions we emit going forward. And in order to draw the future society, we usually set scenario. In this case, this scenario represent how much CO2 emission we emit in the future. And these are a couple of popular scenarios we use in our study. And so this scenario is called RCP scenarios. And RCP 2.6. So this is the scenario which assumes lowest GHG emission in the future. On the other hand, when it comes to RCP 8.5, so it assumes little to no countermeasure to climate change. Anyway, so the important point is that due to the differences in terms of future GHG emission, greenhouse gas emissions, so there is a big differences in terms of the future temperature increase. When we look at RCP 2.6, so the temperature increase is limited to around 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. On the other hand, when we look at RCP 8.5, so the temperature will increase, rise up to around approximately 5 degrees Celsius by 2100. So future temperature increase, is very, very, depending on the amount of emission, GHG emission, so we emit in the future. Okay, so this is the temperature increase in terms of global scales. Then what the temperature increase in Japan? So this figure shows the temperature increase in Japan. And so when we look at the RCP 2.6, the temperature will rise up to 1.9 degrees Celsius at the middle of 21st century. And also, even at the late 21st century, so the increased amount is almost same as that of, at the middle 21st century. This is because, the GHG emission, the amount of GHG emission is saturated. Yes, the temperature change is almost not much different between middle and the late of 21st century. On the other hand, when we look at RCP 8.5, so temperature increase at the middle of 21st century is 2.1 degree, maybe not so much different from that of RCP 2.6. However, when we look at the end of this century, so this temperature increase is up to approximately 5 degrees Celsius. Anyway, even in Japan, the differences in terms of future GHG emissions, amount of future GHG emission is, is very, influential in terms of, temperature in Japan. Okay, so, due to temperature increase, we can also expect the historical cases will increase in Japan. So, to address these issues, we projected the number of patients with heat stroke transported by ambulance, also considering the effect of long-term heat adaptation. And so this is the result. So in this figure, so the value of base year is set to unity. And if this number is more than unity, that means heat stroke cases will increase in the future. So, and this, without adaptation means we do not consider, the kind of, effect to strong against heat. On the other hand, with adaptation, that means we also consider the long-term heat adaptation. So if we consider heat adaptation, we can see that, heat stroke increase in heat stroke cases is not so large compared to those without heat adaptation. But this number is still more than unity. That means heat stroke cases will increase in the future. And again, so looking at the end of this century, so due to temperature increases, we see the heat stroke cases will increase in the future. Anyway, so important point from this study is that so due to climate change, we expect that heat stroke will increase in the future. So additional adaptation measure is very, very important to reduce the risk of heat stroke in the future. Okay, so we also conduct this kind of studies. So, if there are so many heat stroke patient, there may not enough ambulance to treat all of that patient. During COVID-19, so we see the shortage of ambulances. Maybe we will see the same situation in terms of heat stroke cases if the number increases in the future. So in this study, we examine whether this kind of situation occurs or not in the future. And so based on our result, so if this number is 100%, that means we can transport all patients by available ambulance cars. But if this number is more than 100%, that means we do not have enough ambulance cars to treat all of the patients with heat stroke. So our results show that during mid of this century, this value get closer to the 100%. And when we look at the RCP 8.5 scenario, so this is the very kind of serious scenario. So this number go beyond 100%. This means we do not have enough ambulance cars to treat all of the patients. Again, in the end of this century, so this number also go up to higher due to temperature increases. Anyway, important point is that due to climate change, not only just increase of heat stroke cases, but also this kind of difficulty in terms of ambulance transport will also occur. So in order to reduce this kind of serious situation, reduce the risk of heat stroke, and also proper use of ambulance is also important. This is one of the message from this study. Okay, so and increase in ambulance transport will place an economic burden on local government. In Japan, ambulance transport are controlled by the local government. So local government pay every budget to transport patient. So we also evaluate the cost in the future due to climate change. So you can easily imagine that the cost will increase in the future due to climate change. So this kind of information is also very useful for the local government to consider their adaptation measures, how they reduce the cost of ambulances due to heat stroke. Okay, so these are kind of our basic study. So we also collaborate with local government because to implement effective adaptation measures, it is very important to understand regional heat and heat stroke conditions. And in this context, we work together with local government, for instance, to conduct meteorological observations and also analyze the heat stroke dispatch data in the region. So today time is limited. I don't go in detail, but these are a couple of examples of WGT observations conducted by the local government. So WGT observations are being carried out in the various places to better understand the local heat conditions. And so this is the example of analysis and projection of heat stroke risks in the future. Again, I don't go in detail, but so there are so many variety of studies conducted by the local government. And now, by the way, I also collaborated with the Nagasaki prefecture, so in this study. And so not only this kind of analysis, we also conduct the activity related to raising awareness. Anyway, so I collaborate with local government to reduce the risk of heat stroke in the regional scales. And collaboration with local government is very important. At the same time, collaboration with private sector is also very important. So to promote the social implementation of heat stroke countermeasure, collaboration with company is very important because, this kind of collaboration enable us to challenge new researches that could not be implemented by NIES or institute alone. And this is one of the example of the collaboration with private sector. So in this study, we try to verify the effect of heat acclimatization through the, taking a bath, So this, study is just started, but, we are very looking forward to the result from these collaborations. And so this is another example of the collaborations. So, rising temperature due to climate change have made worsening heat stress in the, for instance, soccer field, football field, whatever, any, field outside. So in this study, we tried to evaluate how heat stress conditions could be relieved by introducing heat mitigation measures in the football field through WGT observations, this kind of observation. So as a heat mitigation countermeasure, so in this study, we store a system, we introduce a system that stores rainwater beneath the field. So this, this rainwater can reduce the air temperature lower due to the evaporating cooling effect. Again, so this study just started in this summer, so we are continuing this study to find the rigid effect of this countermeasures. And also, this is another example of the collaboration. So in order to gain a broad insight from the private sectors, a research group was established by inviting private companies and organizations from various industries. So this, project itself was ended in 2024, but since we can build a very broad, network with private companies, now I'm, planning to start a new initiative called Heathrow Industry Government Academic Consortium. So based on this activity, we hope to, implement effective adaptation measures and reduce the risk of heat stroke in Japan. So finally, let me introduce our Center for Climate Change Adaptation at NIES. So our center was established in December 2018. So our mission is to promote climate adaptation both domestically and internationally. So this is a systematic view of our network to promote adaptation measures in Japan. So we are study research organizations. We collaborate with relevant university or organizations. At the same time, we are collaborating with regional government to implement adaptation measures. And also we collaborate with the private sector, and we also disseminate information on adaptation measures to the citizen. So one of the important activity at our center is to promote the adaptation by providing scientific information and also technical advice. So in order to implement these activities, we built a web platform system called APLAT. So through this APLAT system, we try to disseminate information related to adaptations. And this is the top panel of the APLAT. So I just write URL. So if you have a chance, please visit this website to see what kind of information you can find in this platform system. And today, so I would like to introduce a couple of contents stored in this APLAT. So one of the example is infographics. So we can find so many, books or, papers describing about, climate change impact or adaptation, but usually, only words, characters, very difficult to understand for the ordinary people. So in order to, address these issues, so we are developing what we call infographics. So infographics are kind of contents, so that, enable, sending, important information by visually. So, this kind of content is very, very useful, especially ordinary citizens. So this is the example of, history cases. So by preparing this kind of, easy to understand content, we try to disseminate adaptation measures or adaptation information to the citizens. And so we often hear from the local government asking what kind of measure can be considered as adaptation measures. So in order to answer to these questions, APRAT provides the existing adaptation measures conducted by the local government. So these are some of the examples of adaptation measures or relevant activities conducted by the local government. So this kind of information is very, very useful for the local government because, they can, think the same adaptation measure in their region. And we also hear same question from the private sector: what kind of activity can be the adaptation, measures for the private sector? So in order to answer to these questions, we also prepare we also provide the information related to adaptation measures conducted by the private sectors. Again, so these are a couple of, existing adaptation measures conducted by the private sectors. Okay, so this is the summary of my presentation. So just beginning of my presentation, I just mentioned that heat stroke is becoming an increasing serious issue in Japan. So we see so many ambulance transport and also heat stroke deaths by heat stroke. And due to climate change, we expect that the risk of heat stroke will increase in the future. However, what I want to insist today is that the heat stroke can be prevented if appropriate adaptation measures are adopted. I just, introduced heat stroke alert system. We already know tomorrow is very hot. Using this information appropriately, so we can prevent the heat stroke. So in order to, reduce the risk of heat stroke from the academic side, we NIES promote various activities to reduce the risk of heat stroke through collaboration with relevant organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Oka-sensei, for your presentation. So I will invite Lina sensei as a discussion, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lina MADANIYAZI from School of Tropical Medicine and Global Health. I am an environmental epidemiologist with interest on assessing and projecting the health impact of climate change and air pollution. So thank you very much for staying with us here today until now. So before I start sharing my thoughts on Dr. Oka's presentation, I have one question to you. do you know the temperature today? How high it is or how low it is? Do you know the temperature today? Yes? Do you feel very warm today? Which is very unexpected for 20th of December, it's already. And I just checked the temperature. The maximum temperature and minimum temperature today actually is 22 Celsius degree and 13 Celsius degree. And don't forget, we are very close to Christmas. So we had this concern over our lunch discussion that Santa-san may have a heat stroke on his way to Nagasaki, causing some delays in terms of delivering Christmas present. So thank you very much for Oka-sensei for your very comprehensive and very timely introduction and presentation of the work on climate change and the heat stroke. So the information is quite comprehensive. I could not summarize all of them in one slide, but if I were have to summarize, here are the three key points. The first one is clearly heat stroke is becoming a major or urgent public health concern in Japan, especially among the older adults aged over 65 years old, and also happens more frequently in those who stay at home. And the second message, under a changing climate or warming climate, it is projected that heat-related health risk will continue increasing in Japan in the future. And what is more concerning is that these numbers is projected to increase even under different assumptions on population adaptation to the climate change. And then the last point is that, don't worry, at least we can still do something. There are approaches, ways we can collaborate together. However, in order to have these effective and efficient adaptation strategies, it requires locally tailored, evidence-based measures and strong collaborations. So one perspective I really appreciate from Oka-sensei's talk or presentation today is that his work shows a very good example of how connecting scientific evidence with practical adaptations by involving or collaborating with researchers, local governments, communities, healthcare workers, including emergency services. And I think you all agree with me that this kind of evidence is especially important for Japan because in Japan we are having a rapidly aging population and also a rapidly changing climate. And one important point I think I learned from Oka-sensei's presentation today is that when we talk about the health impact of this warming climate, it's not just about the temperature. It also involves different vulnerable factors such as age, housing conditions, and also it includes the capacity of the healthcare systems, their preparedness, and also the local community. And don't forget, he also mentioned in his presentation that sometimes when heat happens, there could be another hazard happening at the same time. For example, pandemic, or typhoon, or power shortage. And at that time, the impact of the heat can be even much higher under such kind of conditions. And also, one point from, if we look ahead from Oka-sensei's presentation, it also raised the question how we continue strengthening the link between scientific evidence on climate-related projections and the actions or preparedness. So my background is environment epidemiologist, so I know that in Oka-sensei's presentations, all those statistics numbers he's shown there, actually it is derived from very complicated statistical modelings under different assumptions, which also has some uncertainties there. So how to communicate these assumptions, uncertainties with local people and with people from other area, that is also quite important. And a second point I would like to highlight is that how adaptation measures or approaches perform over time is also need to be assessed and considered throughout the way. Again, because this climate keeps changing, and also the society, the population are changing at the same time. So the adaptation measure works today, may not work in the next 5 years. So we need to keep this in mind and assessing and adapting at the same time. I think this is, I don't think I lost a slide. So this should be my last slide. So in the end, if I have to summarize again, the final reflections here is that first, a strong and policy-relevant foundation for advancing heat health adaptation in Japan is needed. But I believe it's not only for Japan, but also for other countries all over the world. And I think from Oka-sensei's presentation, he showed very good examples of how the scientific evidence he and his colleague generated has been used by the local government, and how his team has engaged with local communities, including students, the younger generations, and as well as with athletes, soccer players, how to help them to cope or adapt to this climate change. And also he involved the private sectors as well here. So basically, his work is suggesting if we want to address this, we need to work together. And then the second is that how scientific evidence can inform or can change, improve the real-world decision-makings, only if when we take it carefully and seriously. And at last, it also offers a valuable model for linking climate research with public health actions. So I do have a few questions later on. I would like to ask Oka-sensei's suggestions and opinions, but I will stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina Sensei, for your clear discussion. So now, Professor Tamura, please give us your comments on emerging risks and challenges.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I would like to thank all the previous presenters and also discussants. I feel pressured to come at the very end. When I was trying to figure out what to discuss in this session, I started with an attempt to list all the possible and existing risks and challenges, particularly to climate change, but also planetary health, which Nagasaki University considers very important. And the list got very long. The ones that you see on the screen are just part of my list, and it goes on and on. So I realized that it won't fit into my slot. So I, like this. So I then tried to identify approaches, principles, requirements, prerequisites that can work as instruments or can be instrumental to addressing risks and challenges. And the list got very long again, but still manageable. But I thought I need a focus, so I classified my list into 3 categories. And now I realize that my presentation of the 3 categories could actually serve as a summary of the earlier presentations and discussants. I think we are actually on the same wavelength. So the 3 categories that I came up with are commitment, capacity, and collaboration. And let me just go through each one of them. So for commitment, we need policies to support and realize our commitment. The policy framework should be relevant, focused, coordinated, and ready for enforcement. We also need accountability to set goals in an articulated manner. We also need to monitor progress and report those progresses. And we also need to look at each cycle and evaluate to draw lessons. Inclusion is another important concept under commitment. We need to unleash potential of human resources, and we also make sure to promote equity, and so that we can maximize the impact of our actions. Continuity is another important aspect, but by continuity, I not only mean continuous actions themselves, but also necessary supporting mechanisms to facilitate such continuity. Under capacity, learning is important. Earlier presenters discussed for example, North-South cooperation or South-South cooperation. I think mutual learning is very powerful. Also, we have accumulated and shared knowledge, which will facilitate to help concerted efforts. Institutions are very important. Dr. PETRIG mentioned legal and regulatory frameworks for automated ships, and that's one important area. But also, I would like to point out policy making and implementation capacity is very important but difficult to build. Governance is, again, also very important but difficult to put in place. For appropriate mobilization, distribution, and use of limited resources, including finance. We definitely need functioning governance. And checks and balances in implementing policies is also a critical issue. We need to face and mitigate uncertainties to the extent possible. We have vulnerability, fragility, and extreme events such as extreme weathers, which are mentioned in earlier presentations. We need to identify them, but we also need to set mitigation measures. The last category is collaboration, and I was very happy to hear a lot of presenters talk about this concept. Now, finance is obviously very important. We have a very big and also growing need for financing our activities and initiatives. We need to put public, private, and hybrid sources to engage with all these stakeholders and then also push our agenda forward. Innovation is one area which a lot of previous presenters also talked about. Efficiency gains and productivity enhancement would probably ease risks and challenges facing us. Participation is also very important. We cannot leave any communities, citizens, individuals behind because they all contribute to, but also benefit from mitigating risks and challenges, including planetary health initiatives. partnerships are also instrumental for us to pursuing our shared visions and accelerate our collective efforts. And those will probably lead to help us our planet healthy. Now, I would like to show you two examples in Asia and the Pacific, which, in my view, successfully manage to reflect those elements that I have just presented into their design and operations. The first example comes from the countries in the Mekong River. 6 countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, and 2 southern provinces of China have jointly worked on various risks and challenges within their region called the Greater Mekong Subregion Program since its inception in 1992. Among many different risks and challenges that they are faced, strengthening communicable diseases control and cross-border health security has been one important area in terms of providing a regional public good. In recent years, such efforts and successful experiences have helped expand their initiatives to promote national and regional universal health coverage. Now, we have just heard Dr. Oka's presentation on heat stroke. I don't think heat stroke is has become one of their focus health issues, but since they share the same climate and geographical locations, early warning systems, for example, and treatment of such emergency health conditions may actually benefit from regional cooperation. Support for regional and sub-regional health security has been embedded in their infrastructure projects. For example, consideration for HIV/AIDS has been quite well reflected in the design and implementation of transportation projects. That's just one example. Another case is in the Pacific. There are some atoll nations in the Pacific region, particularly Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, and Tuvalu. They are challenged with climate and economic vulnerabilities. One of the problems is that their market is too small to seek scale economies, but by collaborating and working together, they are actually promoting sustainable blue economy, which they believe to tap into their strengths as ocean states. Circular processes, sustainable production and consumption, climate stability and resilience, health ecosystem, and equity and inclusion will lead to sustainable blue economy. I would also like to point out, as they are actually already working on it, it's very important for them to collaborate on regional policy making. And they would like to expand investment opportunities, as I explained earlier, that their economies are too small to sort of stand alone. So putting their markets and resources together, they could try to maximize the impact of such initiative. And they would like to also put small, micro, and small-size enterprises in the driver's seat, because after all, the private sector should also be engaged in such effort to mitigate risks and challenges. So I would like to thank all the presenters and discussants again, and I think we everyone in this room has a role to play in pursuing these three elements of mitigating risks and challenges: commitment, capacity, and collaboration. And I hope platforms such as this will lead us to more sort of concerted efforts toward our shared vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tamura. So all speakers, please come to the front. So we now move on to the Q&A session. We have like 15 minutes for your questions and comments for all speakers. So please state your name and affiliation when you are called on. So if you have any questions.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yumiko Kasuga, Vice Director of the CGR and from School of Tropical Medicine and Global Health and the Interfaculty Initiative in Planetary Health. And I have a question to Professor PETRIG. In addressing the technology-driven risk, how do you think about the role of risk assessment in emergent technology? And another second question is that how do you think about the value and meaning of the ethical education for emergent technology? Whether is it helpful for students or young researchers or engineers who develop or who studies the new technology about the potential or possibility of misuse, unintentional use of the technology they're facing or they're handling with? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting question. So I think the risk assessment is key, because if you assess the risk wrongly, then there is the risk that you adopt the wrong measures, be it wrong regulation or wrong adaptation measures or whatever. However, the example of the trains also demonstrated that it's difficult to assess risks, even if you use the best possible science. And I guess nowadays there is an additional risk that at least there are movements which do no longer believe much in science. So more and more policies or laws are adopted without a solid scientific basis, or scientific facts are denied. And I guess that poses additional risks if science cannot play the role it should in the risk assessment. Then whether those building the technology or future generations should be trained in law and ethics in relation to these technologies, I guess that's key, because often compliance with the law must be built into that new technology. For instance, I'm also doing research on autonomous weapon systems, and the compliance with the law of armed conflicts, you must build it in, because traditionally, you would teach the person using the weapon to comply with the laws of war. However, if there is no longer a human in the loop, you need to build in the compliance into the technology. So it's increasingly important that lawyers or those experts in ethics enter into a dialogue with those developing the technology, although it's often difficult because we are somehow living on different planets, and maybe that's the beauty of this symposium, that it brings together perspectives. And the symposium very well showed that often risks are interdependent, and it's a concern of the international community as a whole. I guess your presentation on heat strokes, I guess it's very much the same in Central Europe. And so it's really important to have an interdisciplinary dialogue, but since we all speak different languages, in terms of like our disciplinary languages, it needs an additional effort. But I guess the more complex our problems become, it's important that we are interdisciplinary in our approach. So the organizers of the symposium are very much to be commended for taking this approach.
Other questions? Any other? Oh, yes, please.
Thank you. My question is, I'm sorry, my name is Lisa Lim. I'm from Kazakhstan. I'm from Nazarbayev University to attend a seminar. My question is to Oka Sensei, related to climate change impact on health and adaptation measure. So you mentioned about climate change in terms of the heat, but then also in Kazakhstan we have a very extreme weather condition. One day gets really hot, then the next day it gets really, really cold. So we have two different type of climate change dimensions as well. So I wanted to know about your thoughts on that. And you mentioned about economic impact on ambulance cost, but I'm just wondering whether you expand the cost of healthcare facility, and as well as what are the probably cost of the labor. 65, I'm not sure whether they are still working, but many senior here is working. So I'm just wondering whether you have a chance to analyze loss of economic activities in terms of economic burden of climate change. And also lastly, I'm really sorry that you mentioned about collaborating with the government, and the most of the issue was due to power shortage. So I'm just wondering, what are the risk communication that a local community or national community, the authority is doing in terms of risk communication on the climate change, in terms of there will be a power shortage next day. Have you guys done that? So that's the kind of area. I'm really sorry for so many questions.
Thank you very much for your question. So 3 questions. Okay, so regarding the first question, so you are talking about the kind of fluctuation of daily temperature or precipitation. Yeah, even in Japan, so we see daily differences in terms of temperature, precipitation. But maybe compared to your country or European countries, so that fluctuation is not so large in Japan. So in that sense, so at this moment, we do not care about that fluctuation in terms of climate change. But yeah, in the future, so there are possibilities that this fluctuation can become larger even in Japan. So we have to pay attention for that issue. Thank you. And regarding the second question, yeah, in my study, I just, this is kind of my first step to, conduct economic evaluation in terms of heat stroke. And I just pick up the ambulance transport cost. One of the reasons for this is that, as I mentioned, ambulance transport is controlled by the local government, so they have to, cover all budget for that transportation. So in this sense, I just focus on, ambulance transport cost only. But as you mentioned, not only, transport cost, but also medical cost. or any economic loss. So this should be, comprehensively, evaluated. So this is kind of my next, target for, for my study. And regarding, compound impact, so as far as I remember, maybe the issues in Chiba is the only, cases we see so far. And so, compound impact, natural disaster and heat wave, it's still not so popular, but maybe in the future, not only heat wave, but also natural disaster will also become serious due to climate change. So we have to pay attention to this kind of compound impact. And I also try to disseminate compound impact like this to promote their adaptation measures against this kind of impact. Yeah, thank you very much for your questions.
Regarding Lisa's question, I would like to add a few more. So you mentioned about the economic cost of this heat-related risk. Actually, at the current moment, we don't have a very good economic indicator to really quantify the economic impact of this heat. I think that is mainly because of the nature of the relative risk from our assessment. It involves several assumptions, which apparently becomes some major challenges when it comes to the economic cost evaluation. And regarding the compound or like a power shortage at the same time and then the heat, I think because this compound hazard or compound event, even in academia, is still, relatively speaking, a bit new terminology for climate change and health area. So they have a different definition. So for this power shortage, because this is unexpected power shortage, so it's difficult to predict. But I understand that for Ministry of Environment in Japan, they have this system, this alert platform, where it involves all the alert information for all the climate-related disasters, but it does not include the other non-climate risk factors. But I think that's a very good point. For example, when there is a typhoon, there is a high chance that we may have a power shortage. Yes, thank you.
Uchida sensei.
My name is Konari Uchida from Waseda University, and thank you so much for your insightful presentations. I have a question to each of the two presenters, and then to Professor Anna. I want to ask you about your opinions about the relationship between regulation and technology innovation. So I think the most important target of the regulation will be maybe preventing some serious accident or something, but meanwhile, the too stringent regulation might, restrain the company's innovation or technology development. So it might be some negative aspect of the regulation. But meanwhile, some, environmental economics people argue that regulation will, make innovation actually, because when the regulation gets stringent, maybe the companies have to bear the cost, and they're going to have to reduce their cost, and then this necessity for the cost reduction generates innovation. Actually, there's some empirical evidence about that. And then so, I want to ask about how do you think about, the regulation or, soft law or something impacting on the company's innovations on your framework? So this is a question to Anna. And then to the Professor Oka, I really agree with you that heat stroke is a super important problem in Japan, and then we need to do something to prevent that kind of, the disaster. But I think the very elder people, living single at their home is very problematic. Sometimes, we hear some news saying, so single living person, doesn't get access to any information, and then sometimes so they want to save money, and they don't use air conditioning in a very hot summertime, and then so sometimes so they might pass away in a single situation. So I'm curious, so how we can do this kind of problem, because it's really hard to communicate with these people. It's really difficult to give lessons or scientific evidence to them. And so I want to know your opinion about how we can, what we can do about this kind of problem. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your question. When I started to do research on the topic, I first thought that maybe industry doesn't want regulation because then everything is possible. But actually the contrary turned out, because they say if it's not regulated, then it's not permitted to use. So why invest huge sums in a technology which can maybe not be used? So they want to have the certainty that their product can ultimately be used. So you need regulation. But then there is the challenge, if you adopt regulation too early, you may lock in at a very inferior technology. So that also could prevent innovation. So I guess soft law is a possibility to have regulation, but which can be changed. So actually, when I discuss with industry, there is very much a call for swift action in terms of regulation. And what some states do is so-called sandboxing, that they allow the use of technology in a provisional fashion without a full regulatory framework to kind of collect experience. So there are different models to give industry an incentive to proceed with innovation, and at the same time giving the regulator time to regulate. So it's a bit of back and forth, but there is a close linkage between innovation and regulation.
Yes, thank you very much for your questions. So I just, talk about the case of Tokyo. So sorry, Tokyo. So looking at the, historic deaths in Tokyo, usually 200 cases each year, and among them, 90% of them, they are not using air conditioning. And 50% of that number, so they don't use air conditioning, even if they have air conditioning. And another 50%, they don't have air conditioning. In this sense, if they can use air conditioning properly, so we can reduce the 90% of heat stroke deaths in Tokyo. And there are a couple of reasons they don't use air conditioning. One of the reasons is that there are some tendency that elderly, so they do not so sensitive to hot temperature, even if it's hot. So in this sense, so raising awareness itself is not so useful, I think. So in this sense, maybe we have to, there is a possibility we can rely on technology. If room temperature becomes some certain threshold, so air conditioning operate automatically. So this kind of technology usage is one of the options we can take. And so you mentioned that some elderly do not have enough kind of money to pay the electric charge. So in that sense, so nowadays there is just some activity, some trial to cover some electricity cost by the local government. Well, when we look at the case in Kyushu, as far as I remember, so Kyushu Denryoku, they reduce some amount of the electricity charge for the family with elderly. So maybe this kind of trial or activity could be one of the options to reduce the risk of heat stroke, I think. But depending on the person, what is the problem for them? So maybe we need a use effective countermeasure for each situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, time is up. So if you have any questions, please ask directly after finishing the symposium. So I'd like to thank for all speakers and your active participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor MIWA, and thank you to all the speakers of session 3. Yes, thank you. You may now please step down from the stage. So all sessions have now concluded. It was a long day, and thank you so much, especially for those who are attending, participating in the morning session, from the morning session. This morning in session 1, we heard about the importance of prediction and the indication of risks and also the possibility of to do it by utilizing mathematics. That was very interesting. And how to respond it, because if the prediction and indication is not even though with prediction and indication, we need to respond to the risks. So, and then Professor Hayanagi presented a kind of case study of Swiss civil defense as a response case. And that was also very interesting. And then in the afternoon session 2, the title of the session 2 was Climate Change and Risk. And we heard presentations about climate change and energy transition in Asia Pacific and the salary gaps between, the problem of salary gaps between CEOs and workers. Due to time constraints, I suppose, we were not able to discuss how the salary gap issues is related to climate change or global risk, unfortunately, but I hope we can continue the discussion on how this kind of issue could potentially be connected to climate change or global risk in the future. And actually, at the first international symposium hosted by our Global Risk Research Center for Global Risk of Nagasaki University last year, actually this issue was addressed in a session when we invited Christian Felber, and he spoke about the third way of economy, the economy for the common good. And he addressed in this concept that we need to really overcome these salary gaps, because salary gaps will produce the division of society. And according to his study, the level of happiness will not change after, according to study, after one can earn the salary around 20,000 euro. So the CEOs does not need to receive more than 20,000 euro because the level of happiness will not change. Anyway, so the session 3 featured discussions on how to regulate emerging technologies and the risks posed by climate change. At the outset of this morning's session, Director Iwashita pointed out that when considering global risks, we should bear in mind that locally occurring risks can potentially lead to global risks. So having listened to all the sessions today, I'm once again struck by the questions of how we can recognize, anticipate, and address or respond what are considered risks in each field as global risks. Because our discipline are so different, and sometimes the word risks, like this morning, Professor Terada explained us how the word or term risks have been developed in sociology. However, like in for example, discipline, international politics, we don't care. We don't care. We use the word risks as we want. So anyway, having said that, let us now give a round of applause to all the speakers who presented today. Thank you very much. And to conclude today's today's symposium, Risk and the International Community, hosted by the Research Center for the Global Risk of Nagasaki University. But before you leave this room, please join or participate in our survey. The two-dimensional code. Yes, Yes, this is, yes, please join in our survey. And yeah, once again, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.